Okay. I hate to break up all the fellowship. I hate to be that guy.
I'm John Hall. Yes, we have not. You were, I guess we better move there. Class. Sorry.
No worries. I always hate being the guy that breaks up all the fellowship. But somebody's got to be the bad guy, I guess. And I can do that. My former times as a security officer, kind of kicking people out of places. All right, good morning, everybody. Appreciate you being here. This morning, we're going to look at 1 Samuel chapter 17. We'll be in 1 Samuel chapter 17. A recap of what we kind of looked at last week. We saw David chosen as king. We saw him anointed as a king. And then we see him enter Saul's service as he plays the lyre to soothe Saul, to help Saul kind of relax, to fight some of the inner demons that he may be battling. We see him become his armor bearer. We see him become one of his most trusted members of his court. He loves David. But unbeknownst to Saul, David has been anointed king already. This week we're going to pick up, like I said, in chapter 17. This is a pretty familiar story to everybody here. It's David and Goliath. You've been taught this story since your first days in Sunday school. You've heard this story. So I'll try to get a little bit more out of it than what you kind of already know, because like I said, you've heard it since you were a baby. But I want to take a look at this. We've got three different kind of points we want to look at. The first point is going to talk about how the future king arrives as an unlikely hero. I want to read a couple of the passages, and then I'm going to kind of set up where we are. So we're going to look in 1 Samuel 17. We're going to start with verse 16. It says, "For 40 days the Philistine came forward every morning and evening and took his stand. Now Jesse said to his son David, 'Take this ephah of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers and hurry to their camp.'" Then we jump down to verse 22 and 24. It says, "David left his things with the keeper of supplies, ran to the battle lines and greeted his brothers. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. When the Israelites saw the man, they all ran from him in great fear." Now if we jump over to verse 32 and 33, we see David is standing before Saul, and he says, "David says to Saul, 'Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him.' Saul replied, 'You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a boy, and he has been a fighting man from his youth.'" So what do we know about the Philistines? We know that the Philistines camped or were their land was on the western side of the Mediterranean Sea as part of the Promised Land. When the Israelites were fleeing from slavery and they crossed the sea, God purposely detoured them away from the Philistines so that they would avoid any kind of early battle. So the Philistines have been in this land for a long time. We know that. We know that there has been back and forth with the Philistines and the Israelites for years. I mean, it goes all the way back like I said, when they first crossed over fleeing slavery. So this has gone on for years and years and years, this back and forth between Israel and the Philistines. There's always battles. And when we look at David here in this story, David was anointed around between the ages of 10 and 12. So he was still just a little boy when he was anointed as future king. The time this story takes place, he's anywhere from 15 to 17. So it's been 5 years since he was anointed king. 5 years he has been a part of Saul's court. 5 years that he has turned into a teenage kid, right? And he's done a lot in these years. Like we said, he was a member of Saul's court. He played the lyre to soothe Saul. He watched his father's sheep. He was a typical teenage boy. I'm sure he got into trouble too. What teenager doesn't get in trouble, especially teenage boys? Ken, I know from talking to Brian, he got into plenty of trouble, didn't he? He tells stories on himself all the time. So, teenage boys, they get in trouble. They grow a lot in those first few years. So David's been through a lot, right? Here, Jesse has sent him to the front lines of this battle. We know that the Israelites are camped on one hilltop, the Philistines are camped on another, and there's a valley in between. We also know that they're having to live off the land while they're in this battle, while they're in this quote-unquote battle, yelling back and forth across this ravine, this valley. They've got to have food. So Jesse sends David to the front lines with food for his brothers. Sends grain, sends bread. And David gets there and goes to greet his brothers. And while they're talking, catching up, and David's telling them all about what he's seen, what's happened to the sheep, what's happening with Dad back home, what's been happening back in the hometown while they're all out here, he hears this bellowing from the other side. He hears this man shouting and taunting the Israelites. Now, this man, we all know, is Goliath. And they say Goliath was about 9 feet 9 inches tall. So think a basketball goal, the hoop on a basketball goal, minus about 3 inches. I'm about 6'1", so add another 3.5 feet to me, and that's Goliath. The average Israelite back then, about 5'5", 5'6", so we'll say this tall. So we're talking, this much size difference. That's maybe a little more. That's quite a bit of difference. We know that Goliath is strong. To be that size, he's got to be strong. He has this armor. He has this metal armor that is so heavy, he has to have people carry it for him. He has armor bearers that carry his armor for him in battle. So not only do you have this guy who's, 4 feet taller than you, yelling out across the ravine, cursing you, cursing your God, he's fitted in head to toe in this armor, and he has people standing around him with his weapons and his shield. And the Israelites are over here lucky to have armor, because in that time, not everybody had access to metal for armor. So the Israelites were lucky to have anything at all in the way of armor, whether it be, leather or whatever. We're lucky They're lucky to have anything. So it had to have been intimidating. And these men have been fighting their whole life, right? Well, here comes this 15-year-old, 16-year-old kid, and he's like, who's this dude? You know, what's he talking about? Who is he to be yelling and yelling at us and cursing our God? And he starts asking everybody, why aren't we fighting him? Why is no one going out to challenge him? And he begins to denounce Goliath out loud. This 16-year-old kid, again, teenage boys, we're dumb. We're dumb. He's out there running around going, I could take him. You know, he's got to be going, I could beat him. Why isn't anybody else strong, standing up? Why isn't anybody else trying to take him on? Just running his mouth. Well, Saul catches wind of this and has him brought before him. And Saul starts asking him, what are you doing? And David replies, he said, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine. Saul says, no, you're just a boy. My question in all of this is, where is Saul? Saul's described as head and shoulders above the rest. So he's not Goliath tall. But if their average is 5'6", he's a little taller than me, so he's got a little closer height advantage. He's got the fancy armor. He's got the armor bearers. Where's Saul in all this? Why is he sitting back here just watching it all happen? Isn't Saul supposed to be the champion for the Israelites? Isn't he supposed to be the king? Where is he in all of this? So David says, fine, if nobody else will do it, I'll do it. Saul says, no, you're just a boy. You can't do it. And you have to wonder what David was thinking at that point, right? David's going, well, you're not going to do it. Somebody's got to do it. We can't go on doing this forever. We can't just sit here forever and yell back and forth at each other. Something's got to give, If we look back, this whole battle, this whole David standing up and saying, I can do this, is David's first step on his way to the throne. This is David standing up and showing the leader he's going to be. Nobody knows it yet, but it's his first step on his way to the throne. When we look a little further into chapter 17, if we start in verse 34, I'll read a few more verses here. Again, we all know this story. But if we start in verse 34, it said, but David said to Saul, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on the sword over the tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. I cannot go in these, he said to Saul, because I am not used to them. So he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch in his shepherd's bag, and with a sling in his hand approached the Philistine. So here we see point 2, the future king trusts in the Lord for victory. This whole section is David giving credit to the Lord. Yeah, he says, guess what I've done? I killed a bear. I killed a lion. This guy's got nothing. Sure, yes, a teenage kid bragging about what he's been able to do. He goes around town going, guess what I did? I saved my sheep, man. I killed that bear. Yeah, I killed that lion. I didn't get my sheep. But if you keep reading further, that's not what he does. Yeah, he tells his accomplishments, but he says, it's because of the Lord. The Lord delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear. And the Lord will deliver me from this Philistine too. He gives full credit to the Lord. How often do we do that? How often do we do that? I know when I do something good or I, hit a goal at work or you finish a project for work, I'm like, yeah, look what I did. Look what we were able to do. Look what we did. And I go, yeah, we did that, but it's because I stepped back and because I gave it to God and I let God direct me and I let God guide me. Or do I just take all the credit myself? Most of the time, I tend to take the credit for myself. And look what I did. But not David. Not David. David does what we now call today as a testimony, right? He gives his testimony. He says, man, I was out in the fields, and this lion came and tried to take one of my sheep. I went after it. I grabbed it by the hair. It let go, and it turned on me. And because of God, I killed that lion. I saved my sheep, and I was unharmed. That bear came after us. I killed him. But it's because of God. You hear people talk about testimonies today. A testimony is just telling people what God's done for you. What's God done in your life? That's a testimony. We're called to give testimony to people, right? We're called to tell people what God has done in our lives. And David, at age 15, 16, is doing that. Like it's second nature. Like he doesn't know any other way to do it. So Saul hears this and he relents. And because of his faith, Saul says, fine, you can go. You can go fight him. In the back of his mind, Saul's going, oh, how am I going to explain this to his family? He's got to be going, how do I explain this? This kid brought supplies to his family. Yeah, he's trusting the Lord, but is that going to be enough? What do I do? Yeah, I can't say no because he's putting his faith in the Lord. So he lets him go. But he says, under one condition, you have to wear this armor. So David, 16-year-old kid, who knows, he may be full height, 5'6", 5'5", stands there, and here comes Saul's armor bearers. Saul's my height, inch or two taller. And they start putting all this armor on him. They put on the leg guards and the breastplate and the helmet, and here's the shield and the sword. And David doesn't know what to do. He can't move. It's not made for him. It's too big. Because Saul's got to be a big guy. He was head and shoulders above the rest. They talk about how his appearance was and how his physique was just that much better than everyone else's. That's how they describe Saul. And here's David, this scrawny teenage kid. He's like, okay. It's like when I was little, I'd put on my dad's, dress shoes or his sport coat, and I walk around, and it's dragging the floor, and my arms like hanging down to here with his sport coat. I'm like, all right, I'm like my dad. It's what it's like. He's like, I can't move in this. I can't fight in this. Like, there's no way I can like lift my arms in time to do anything. I'm history. So he says, no, I'm going to take what I'm used to. And he says, take all this off. He walks over to the stream, and Saul's got to be going, oh, this is really bad. This is going to be real bad. He sees David picking up stones. And we're not talking like little rocks like this big. We're talking, rocks probably about this size. And we hear, David's got his sling, and we're like, oh, that's cute. He's got a sling. But what you don't understand is there were people back in the day who were deadlier and more accurate with a sling than most archers were in that day. You could do more damage with a rock in a sling than you could with a bow and arrow or a spear. There were people who could throw a stone further than a person could shoot a bow and arrow and be more accurate. These things weren't just toys. And these people, this was a weapon for them. This is something they practiced with. Because I always heard this story, and I was like, oh man, that's awesome. And then I got older, and I was like, he used a rock? A rock killed him? But the more you study it, the more you realize you're swinging this thing, and it gets faster and faster. Once you let that go, that thing is like a bullet. So he picks up his stones, and he knows, David knows, he's used it before. He says, all right, we're ready to go. So then we hit the battle, the long-anticipated battle. And we're going to look at verses 45 through 51. Actually, we're going to back up to verse 41. We're going to say, meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw he was only a boy, ruddy and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Come here, he said, and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. David said to the Philistine, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will hand you over to me, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. Today I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, without a sword in his hand, and he struck down the Philistine and killed him. David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword and drew it from the scabbard. After he killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran. So we've got all of this buildup. All these people afraid of this giant. This large man who does nothing but yell at them and curse them and taunt them every day. And he gets out there and he's like, is this really what y'all think of me? You're going to send this kid out here to beat me? Y'all think that little of me? He's like, that's fine. That's fine. I'll kill you and go back to what I've been doing and wait for the next person to come out. And we see that Goliath insults God. He curses David by his gods. And at that point, you got to think David goes, all right, that's enough. That's enough. I've been listening to you run your mouth. I've listened to you talk about how big and bad you are. But now you've gone too far. You've cursed my God. And then David's got to go, wait, what do I say in return? I've never been in this situation before. You know? What's he going to do, trash talk a bear? Trash talk a lion? Yeah, take that, bear. Like, there's nothing, no one to talk back. There's no one to fight back. The bear's dead. So David doesn't know what to do. So he turns around and says, that's fine. You can talk all you want. I got the Lord on my side. And he uses Goliath's words against him. He said, this day I will feed your carcass to the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth. Then he says, the whole world will know there is a God in Israel. So Goliath's got to be going, you can't even come up with your own material, man? Like, you can't even, like that's the best you got? I'm not scared of you at all. And I wonder what his armor bearers are thinking. You know, he's got this guy standing in front of him. He doesn't hold his own shield. Did you notice that? His shield bearer is standing in front of him holding his shield. So this guy's got to be going, you know, is he snickering behind him going, this kid's as good as gone, you know? Standing in front of Goliath, holding his shield, just snickering. You know, what's happening? Like, I always wonder these things. I know there are details that don't matter, but I always wonder about those. Like, what's happening around them? What's everybody saying? What's everybody doing? That's just my brain. That's how I work. And what happens? Goliath says, okay, are you done talking? And he starts to walk forward. He just kind of starts to like, all right, let's get this over with. David takes off on a run. And as he's running, he's got a sling in his hand, grabs a stone, puts it in a sling, and he fires that thing off like he shot a gun. He knows exactly when to let it go. He knows exactly how long to spin it to get enough speed behind it, because he's done it before. He lets that thing go. And what does the scripture say? The stone sank into his forehead. And he fell forward. Goliath doesn't even have time to like reach for a sword, reach for a spear. He's just like casually walking. And then he's like, oh, here he comes. All right. And next thing you know, boom. Down he goes. Down he goes. And it's over. So David walks over. He's like, you got to be kicking him. Make sure he doesn't like try to get up or anything. You got to be kicking him. Once he's sure he's down, takes out his sword, cuts off his head. Now, it had been agreed upon between the two camps that whoever came out and battled Goliath, whoever won, the loser would surrender and become slaves to the other. Once the Philistines see that their champion, that they knew they were going to have new slaves, they were going to have new people to come and work for them, they were in the clear, everything was good. Once they saw, he just was running his mouth. Maybe he wasn't all he was cracked up to be. What do? They turn and they run. You know the Israelite army's got to be going, huh? What? And then all of a sudden David turns and looks at him and is like, go. They take off after the Philistines. Some get away, most of them they kill. But the more and more I read this story, and the more I studied for this, again, it's like I told you, I read the story and I'm like, he killed him with a rock? But the more I studied about how they used those slings and how deadly they could be with those slings, it was like, oh, okay. That's impressive, you know? I mean, because you got to think of the armor that Goliath wore. It said he was covered. So he had probably, this much space open on his forehead from where his helmet came down. Because no one's going to be able to hit you right there with an arrow or get to me close enough to hit me with a sword. So David running knows, okay, that's where I got to go. The only open spot that Goliath has. And it amazes me. It just amazes me. Yeah, I've heard this story 1,000 times growing up. And I always thought, that was cool, the little guy beat the giant. That's what you think of when you're little. You're like, all right, the little kid beat the giant. And then you start to learn more and more and more. Now, you notice at the start of the battle, when Goliath is taunting David, he curses him by his gods. Well, it's because during that time, it was thought and it was believed that whoever was victorious in battle had the more powerful gods. So that was common practice back then. They would taunt you and curse your gods and say, yours aren't good enough, mine are better. And I'll prove it, we're gonna win, and whoever won, it was thought that their gods were more powerful. And David says, that's fine. That's fine if that's how we're gonna be. Today I'm gonna beat you, and the whole world is gonna know. The whole world is going to know that there is a God in Israel. And here we are thousands of years later talking about a God who's the God of Israel. Still talking about him to this day. Now, something interesting, a couple of interesting points here, and we're going to finish a little early today, but I got to reading, and the footnotes in my Bible pointed me over to 2 Samuel, and it was talking about Goliath again. And I was like, wait a minute. He was killed back then. And talk about the family and the tribe that he came from, how it talked about how great they were and how big all they were and how great in battle they were. But the more you read, it was the brother of Goliath. So Goliath's brother picks up his mantle and starts taunting people and does the same thing. And he gets killed. And I had never noticed that before. I'd never noticed that a book later, Goliath's brother is killed in battle, running his mouth like his big brother. So I guess a big mouth and terrible fighting skills runs in the family. But it caught me really off guard, because if you look at some scripture, It just says he killed Goliath. But then you go back and you do some research. It's the brother of Goliath. So he wasn't the only one that they called on to try to taunt people and try to, get him to fight, But I think the most interesting thing I read, probably out of this whole story, was, and I'm going to jump back for a second, then I'm going to jump forward in the chapter. Early on in the chapter, Saul tells everyone, whoever can beat Goliath will have riches, will have a tax exemption, and will get to marry one of my daughters. So you would think that I'll be going, ooh, that sounds pretty good for my family. Let's give it a shot, right? No one does. Here comes David. He kills Goliath. And at the very end of the chapter, if we start in verse 55 and read through the end of the chapter, we're kind of stepping back a little bit, and we're seeing things from Saul's perspective. It says, as Saul watched David going out to meet the Philistine, he said to Abner, commander of the army, Abner, whose son is that young man? Abner replied, as surely as you live, O king, I don't know. The king said, find out whose son this young man is. As soon as David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul, with David still holding the Philistine's head. Whose son are you, young man? Saul asked him. David said, I am the son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem. This caught me really off guard. Because just a chapter before, we talked about David being in his court, playing the lyre to soothe Saul's troubled mind. He was one of his armor bearers. He was one of his most trusted members of the court. Just a chapter before, in chapter 16. And now in 17, David walks up and Saul's like, who's this kid? We don't know how much time passed between the two chapters. We do know that the 5 years between David's anointing and Goliath. But in just one chapter, he goes from one of the most trusted members of the court to Saul has no idea who he is. Why? Why do you think that is? Many scholars and many people think that this is proof that the Lord was no longer with Saul. At this point, the Lord has left Saul. And he can't even remember the details of one of his most loved and most trusted members of his court. And I don't know if I'd ever read those last 4 verses before, or if I'd ever thought about it. But here comes David. He's walking up to kill the giant, and Saul goes, hey, we know who this kid is? Where did he come from? And his right-hand man's like, got me, king. I don't know. He was asked specifically by name to come and soothe the king. He sat there days and days and days and played to soothe Saul's troubled mind. And all of a sudden, Saul has no idea who he is. Has he changed that much? Did he leave the court and go back to his father and start tending his sheep? And he changed that much? Did he, had he grown a beard? Had he gotten bigger? Had he, what had changed? Saul getting old. Saul getting a little forgetful. Or is what they say, could what they say be right? Is this kind of the point where God's left Saul? And we kind of see the start of the downfall of Saul. Because this is David's first big step towards the throne as king. So has God switched his favor to one that he knows is going to rule? And I tell you, the more Ryan spoke this morning, the more I kept looking at my wife going, if he goes into my lesson, and if he steals part of my lesson, I'm going to have to beat him up. But we see what happens from here. We see how Saul starts to fall out of favor, and we see how David starts to become more prominent and more prominent. So that's just something to think about. Those last 5 verses, Saul's going, who is this kid? You got to think David walks up and he's going, all right, he's going to, David gets there, he's saying hi to everybody, he's saying hi to his brothers, and they're like, hey, the king wants to see you. And he's like, well, I didn't bring my lyre with me, but I'll see what I can do. He walks up and he starts talking to the king, and he's thinking Saul's going to recognize him, and he walks away, and Saul goes, who was that? Who is that kid? Anybody know? Again, after hearing this and reading this story hundreds of times growing up, there's 4 verses I'd never seen before. And that's going to bother me, and that's going to drive me crazy for who knows how long. Because now I'm going to have to go back and figure that out. Because it's going to take a whole lot more study. So, again, we pulled out a story that everybody's heard hundreds of times. Hopefully I pulled out a little bit more for you this time. Hopefully I kind of brought some things up that you hadn't thought about, hadn't heard, hadn't, crossed your mind before or in a while. But that's all I have for today. Next week, we're going to be looking at David, the faithful king. And I believe that's Ken, All right, well, there's the first bell. So we're not going to get out as early as I thought we might. But that's all I have for today, everybody. I appreciate it. Thank you.